From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
4 months after Russia's invasion, how is Ukraine faring? We'll have updates from two Journal correspondents who've been watching it closely. Jillian Melchior from Kyiv and Adam O'Neal, who has recently been in Finland and Sweden, which are eager to join NATO. We'll see how that's going. And the big question, can Ukraine hold off further Russian military gains until more Western weapons arrive? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I'm here, as I said, with Adam O'Neal and Jillian Melchior. Jillian, let's start with you. You've been in Kyiv now for a couple of weeks, a little short of that. What's the mood there now? I mean, I sense that there's growing concern about how the war is faring in the eastern Donbass region, where Russia is using its military and artillery advantage to gain new ground. What are you hearing and seeing?
Yes, I do think there's been a shift in the mood, certainly after the Ukrainians pushed Russians back from around Kiev. Earlier, there was a sense that we can really win this thing. I think that has settled down into a sense of weariness and an acknowledgement that this war is probably going to go on for a very long time. Kiev right now itself is a really strange combination of normalcy and war status. Cafes are open. People are trying to keep the economy alive. At the same time, it's not unusual to be woken up at 1 or 2 in the morning with an air raid siren. So that's just kind of the mix here right now.
And are missiles still hitting parts of Kyiv?
Yeah, on the day I got in, there had been, I think it was 4 missiles that hit a train depot. Russia claimed that it was targeting military equipment. The Ukrainians say that this is just a depot where they repair trains, and in particular, trains used for transporting grain.
Are you hearing real concern from your military sources there about the course the war is taking in the East?
I think people are concerned, absolutely. I mean, the most shocking thing that I've heard is how outgunned Ukrainian soldiers are in the East. I'm hearing the ratio of ammunition is about 1 to 10, and this is with shelling. So they're just getting pounded on the front line. It's really brutal, and there's concerns that they are running critically low on ammunition. They feel like the distribution of some of the weapon systems that the West has promised are being slow-walked, and that is out of political reasons.
Really? You think that they believe they're being slow-walked for political reasons, not just because of the logistics difficulties?
Yeah, that's what I've heard pretty uniformly, that this is an issue of political will.
Any evidence of that?
I think people keep pointing toward Germany in particular. It's had some soaring rhetoric, but if you look at what it actually provided, it's not as much as it would seem given some of the public comments.
Adam, yeah, you follow Germany. They were going to supply some Cheetah tanks. That's the name of the tanks. And I've heard it mocked as the slowest Cheetahs in the world because they're taking so long to get there. What do you think about that view from Kyiv? Any truth to it? I mean, the U.S. has provided the bulk of the weapons so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. Over the weekend, I was going back and reading some of our coverage from the opening stages of the war and the months leading up to it, particularly when Germany offered to provide 5,000 helmets, which was almost insulting.
Almost insulting?
It probably would have been better off of providing nothing, right? And since then, they've provided, I forget the exact numbers, right, but more small arms equipment and not that helmets aren't useful, and there's been some reports of the shortage of body armor, for example. Things like that are necessary, but they've provided some of the smaller, faster weapon systems that were really useful in the first phase of the war, right, when there was an attempt at regime change and the Russians were highly unsuccessful. But now we can kind of think of it as a second phase of the war, when this is a grinding artillery battle with heavy losses. And I think the Ukrainian, a Zelensky advisor, said we need 1,000 howitzers, 300 multiple launch rocket systems, and 500 tanks, right? And the United States, we can provide some of that. The Poles can provide some. But if you're the largest economy in Europe and you haven't, as far as I know, haven't delivered any actual heavy weapons, there have been promises, but it seems like the Chancellor of Germany is always finding a reason to not quite do it yet. And perhaps even more insidious on Germany's behalf is that there's some reporting in German newspapers that the Germans are actually blocking or had actually blocked Spain from sending tanks that were made in Germany. And if that's true, that's utterly horrific. It's one thing to not want to help Ukraine and actually help them be victorious. It's another thing to prevent countries that have a more responsible view of doing that. And again, that's only reporting that we've seen in newspapers, but it certainly tracks with the German behavior that we've seen not only since the war began in the months leading up to it, but for years in their general approach to Russia. And unfortunately, the most pro-Russian political party in Germany is now leading the country. And we're seeing the consequences of that right now.
The city of Severodonetsk in the Donbass region has been the focus of late of Russian attention. They're trying to take that, surrounding Ukrainian forces who are desperately trying to hold on to the city. In some ways, it's a replay of what we saw in Mariupol. The Russians are trying to surround Severodonetsk. There's still, as of this morning, I gather, still one open bridge for a supply line from the west, but the Russians are not that far from being able to take the city and surround the forces there. The advantage they have, when we say it's an artillery battle, what advantage the Russians have is not only the amount of firepower, but the range. And they're able to strike far deeper into Ukrainian territory. And the Ukrainians are suffering horrific casualties, upwards of 200 a day, while the Russians, because they're often out of range, are suffering many fewer casualties. And so they're moving and moving and moving ahead and taking some of this territory in the east. And the goal would seem, Jillian, to be, at least initially, to take all of the Donetsk and Luhansk territories that they claim are rightfully a part of this so-called independent areas. And that's considerably more than they have held since 2014. And it's most of what is the Ukrainian industrial region. And so this would do significant harm to the Ukrainian economy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Donbass is also really, really important for Ukraine's energy industry. Yeah, I think what you're describing is absolutely right. What I'm hearing is that range of artillery is important because basically Russians arrive. They don't have to go close to the front line. They don't have to go that close. But the Ukrainians don't have the range, so they have to get really close to the enemy. And they're just getting pounded. I mean, if you look at the amount of shells, somebody pulled out a phone and showed me an aerial picture of it. And it was a field that was just pockmarked with crater after crater after crater. The casualties are, I'm hearing that 100 to 200 fatalities a day. I'm also hearing somewhere around 500 people who are wounded every day. And that's really brutal. I think what we've seen is a shift in Russian strategy. Earlier in the war, they were within the range of Ukrainian fighters, so they'd be able to knock out a couple of those tanks and attack them. Now they're not even getting close enough for you to do that if you're a Ukrainian fighter. So it's really fighting from a safe distance for the Russians, and the Ukrainians don't have that option.
Adam, did I hear you correctly say that the Ukrainians are asking for something like 100 multiple launch rocket systems? Is that how many it is? Or it's 300 multiple.
300, yeah.
300. What's the U.S. supplying? 4?
Yeah, I mean, by one estimate I've seen in some reporting, I think in our newspaper, that the Ukrainians think that the Russians have 10 to 20 artillery pieces for every one that they have. And that's even not including the distance factor that Jill mentioned, right? And the Russians, their artillery isn't as accurate as something like the Caesar system, which France has donated. We don't know exactly how many, but it hasn't been a decisive amount. We certainly know that. But they don't really need to be as accurate because there are just mountains and mountains of artillery shells in storage in Russia. And there's not much that sanctions can do to block them from replenishing those stores, right? Even if they needed to. So they're able to just flatten entire cities. We saw them do that or in the earlier stage in Mariupol, and they're certainly repeating that same strategy here once again. And that's one, horrific on a humanitarian level because you're not just killing soldiers, you're destroying entire cities, which include civilians, perhaps women and children, the ones that weren't able to leave and escape Ukraine to go to Western Ukraine or to go elsewhere in Europe. And the other really difficult part of this is that this was the one reason that so many people thought that Russia would win the war is they had expected them to fight it like this from the beginning, to flatten areas and come in and take the land. And so while Ukraine is going to lose its industrial heartland if Russia is able to consolidate control here, in what is perhaps an irony or a dark irony is that there won't be much left for Russia to use because they'll have destroyed all of this industrial infrastructure, right? Like they did in Mariupol with the Azovstal steel plant. So it's a truly horrific war, really just being fought over land. And it's a cliche to say there are no winners in war, but it's particularly true in this case.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit there, Adam, or maybe it's a difference of emphasis. I mean, I think from Putin's point of view, if he just lays waste to that industrial territory, I assume he figures, well, we'll just rebuild it over time. Meanwhile, Ukraine is denied it, and Ukraine will have that much less ability to actually be sustainable as a nation state. It will have that much more to overcome. He can bide his time, build up in the east, and then wait for the moment when he thinks he can attack the rest of Ukraine or try to take Kyiv again. And I want to just talk about the consequences here in the short term as part of that strategy, which would be if they consolidate control in the Donbass, then they're going to have reestablish another supply line, rail line from Russia down into the Donbass that they can supply their forces. And is a move next to Odessa to be able, in the south, to fully capture all of Ukrainian territory on the Black Sea, Adam.
Well, this is the danger, and I think this is why so many people in Central and Eastern Europe are very skeptical of signing a ceasefire with Putin, right? I think the French, German, and Italian leaders are planning this week to visit Kyiv to talk to Zelensky, and there's a lot of paranoia, maybe not paranoia is the right word, but there's a lot of concern that this is what they're going to push for, is to say, give Putin a ceasefire, and Putin would only accept a ceasefire if he thought it was strategically advantageous. Now, I would agree with you, Paul, that yes, of course he can rebuild and he just wants to reclaim land. I would suggest that what he did get in 2014 in terms of economics wasn't really worth it, even with the relatively weak sanctions 8 years ago. And whatever he'll be facing and losing economically this time probably can't make up for taking a few hundred kilometers of Ukraine. Although, as you point out, if he can move in, cut off Odessa and turn Ukraine into a landlocked rump state, maybe go to Kharkiv as well and make advances there, that's certainly a possibility, especially if there's a foolish ceasefire sign that essentially allows him time to regroup and recover. I mean, the Russians, according to Western intelligence agencies, have lost at least 20,000 men. There's reports of men basically being pulled off the streets in the Donbass and being sent to the front as cannon fodder with almost no military training. So he will face some pressure to continue the war, and there's a real question and a real debate about whether he has the men or the equipment to move forward deeper into Ukraine. But if he doesn't have them now and he can sign a peace deal or some kind of ceasefire that lasts for a couple of years, then the Western position needs to be to keep the pressure on him, even if there's a ceasefire signed, and to not worry about whether he's humiliated. Trust me, Russia was definitely humiliated when they tried to take Kyiv and failed so miserably.
He's bouncing back.
Yeah, and not worrying about his feelings, but focusing on defeating him, not just now, but in the long run.
Your reference to paranoia reminds me of Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, who said only the paranoid survive. It's very much applicable to warfare. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about where the war in Ukraine stands.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Jillian Melchior from Kyiv and Adam O'Neal in Europe as well. Jillian, a couple of other concerns, in addition to the military one, is what's going to happen to the Ukrainian wheat harvest here at the end of the month when it begins in earnest. There's been no progress at all in getting Putin to stop his blockade in the Black Sea where they could ship Ukrainian wheat. They're trying to get some out of the land borders, but is much of this wheat harvest going to go to rot?
Yeah, that is certainly the concern here. You know, you've got Russia controlling Mariupol, which was a key point for Ukrainian exports. It does not control Odessa, but it does control the Black Sea around it, so no ships can get out. And so Ukraine's basically been trying to figure out another way to get that grain out. Its railway system is scaling up as much as it can, but it can do about 10% more, maybe 20% max. But that's going to be really difficult, and that's not only because Ukrainian railway tracks are a different width than European ones, so you can't just send it across the border easily without swapping out wheels. But in addition to that, on the European side, it's really difficult to be able to store and transfer that wheat. There's not enough infrastructure there on that side either. And so I think this is a big problem, and it's something that Putin is doing very much on purpose. He knows that hunger can cause political crises, and he's using it as diplomatic leverage. And unfortunately, there's not really a good way for Ukraine to get around that problem.
Adam, I think we have editorialized that the U.S. ought to put together a coalition of the willing, not NATO necessarily, a coalition of the willing to be able to help Ukraine, to escort ships with Ukrainian wheat, but there seems to be no interest in the U.S. to do this, to lead that. And without the U.S. and its naval power, it's not going to happen, which is going to contribute to higher global food prices. And I'm not ruling out food riots in some cities around the world, particularly in the developed world, if prices really get high or shortages develop. And from Putin's point of view, he may not mind that because I think he feels will put pressure on the West to do the kind of ceasefire deal that you described. And you've got the U.S. now saying, oh, we will provide more weapons. But as we said, they're getting there slowly. Every step of the way here, the U.S., I give Biden credit for putting together some support for the Ukrainians, but every step of the way, we've been just too slow to provide the weapons we needed. They knew it was going to be artillery fight in the Donbass, and yet waited and waited and waited to provide the missile systems that could make a difference. And even now, they're coming slowly and probably not enough.
Putin has really played a lot of Western leaders, I think, quite effectively, and it's a bit of a tragedy. Remember, this was all supposed to be about NATO expansion and Russia being worried about its legitimate security interests. And a few days ago, in public remarks, Vladimir Putin compared himself to Peter the Great, the 18th century Russian ruler who had launched all of these wars to reclaim land that was once theirs. And Putin pointed out, that's what we're doing. We're reclaiming land that actually belongs to us. So all this talk of him feeling threatened or him being placed in danger because Ukrainians want to have a democracy that's a little less corrupt than Russia and they want to be able to choose who they associate with, that was all a lie the whole time. And now Vladimir Putin's rhetoric is, look, I'd like to help you relieve this food shortage that I created. And this is classic Putin, create a crisis and then come in and offer to solve it as long as he gets some concessions and he's rewarded for solving the mess that he made. And what he's doing by bringing the sanctions into the food conversation debate is saying, look, if you guys hadn't imposed sanctions on us, it would be easier for us to feed the world. Of course, it's a blatant lie, but for people who are prone to anti-Americanism or anti-Western narratives, they might find that appealing. So the question is, at what point does the West stop reacting to Putin and start acting more proactively? Everything is a reaction so far to his threats or his warnings or his rhetoric. And in reality, whenever the risk-taking increases and weapons are sent, remember, the Germans were worried that it would lead to a nuclear war if they sent more than helmets, right? And now they're worried that if they send some tanks, that will lead to a nuclear war or some wider war between NATO and Russia. Putin is, according to people I talk to who talk to him, he's not a crazy person. He just gets bad information and makes what he thinks are rational decisions from it. So we should never play down the risk of nuclear war. It's important whenever nuclear states are in conflict, and NATO should not want to go to war with Russia. But at the same time, the NATO shouldn't be allowed to be blackmailed by this kind of behavior, given the overwhelming superiority and the overwhelming strength of the European countries that are allied against Putin. Their greatest problem in negotiation is always negotiating with themselves first.
All right, Jillian, in your time in Kyiv, are you hearing any beginnings of difficulties for support for Zelensky based on how the turn here in the war? And I ask that because if the casualty rate, which Ukraine has been very circumspect about releasing, but if it is as significant as we're hearing, 200 KIA a day, maybe many wounded, how long can Ukraine sustain that kind of casualty list before they and Zelensky will be under enormous pressure domestically to do a ceasefire?
It's interesting. I've asked that question, and I get the sense that people are very reluctant to criticize Zelensky to an international audience because they view him as, for better or for worse, the figurehead of Ukraine right now. They want international solidarity. They're okay with him representing them. What's been interesting, though, I think, is you start to see, I guess, a recognition that this is going to be a long and difficult war. I don't think that they're blaming the Zelensky administration for it, but I do think that there's an acknowledgement of how challenging the situation is. What I keep hearing when I talk to people is that we don't have any other choice, that this is a battle that is existential for Ukraine, that if it does not defend every inch of its territory, much like Adam was talking about, that Russia, if there's a pause, if there's a ceasefire, if there's a negotiated peace, anything that gives Russia more territory and allows it to take a breather just sets the circumstances for the next attack. And I think the attack on Kyiv at the beginning of the war really showed a lot of people that Putin's goal is to take the entirety of Ukraine. That's the perception here. So I think there's an acknowledgement that this is going to be tough. There's a frustration and I would say a rage about the way that Russia is behaving. But for sure, political solidarity and the Ukrainian will to fight is not broken.
Well, it's significant that holds, and I think they're absolutely right. That is Putin's ambition. I'm sure that if he can take eastern Ukraine and then bide his time and wait to see how Zelensky fares in the future, he could still continue to try to assassinate him. No doubt he will try to do that, and then see just to what extent the West continues to support Ukraine. There's no guarantee that the U.S. won't lose patience. That $40 billion aid bill to Ukraine passed Congress, but not without some significant grousing, particularly in the Republican Party, and that's on the Democratic left. And I think even Marco Rubio said the other day, we can't give $40 billion packages every 3 months. So there's a real danger here that as this becomes a grinding war, Putin will end up prevailing. All right, I want to thank Jillian Melchior. Have a safe trip, Jillian, as you traverse back across the border. And Adam, thank you, and thank you all for listening. And every day on Potomac Watch, you can catch us, and please send notes, commentary to pwpodcast@wsj.com. Thanks for listening.